Right, thank you for coming back promptly. We now move on to another of our headline sponsors who are presently leading the league table for I've Got a Bigger Banner Than Everybody Else. I'm delighted to welcome Deloitte, and particularly Patrick and Caroline. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us today. Apologies for the terrible swag that we have brought with us. We will do better next year, but we have got a pretty decent-sized banner, so thanks. Today we're going to cover really some of our experiences as frontline incident responders, and that is the role that Caroline and both I and Caroline do. Deloitte is an NCSC accredited or assured level 1 incident response provider, which means that we are assured to provide incident response services for critical national infrastructure, government, and basically tier 1 industry. And there are 9 of us assured organisations, and they've just introduced a level 2 scheme to increase the number of available options. And so what we're going to cover today is some of the kind of the ground truth of what we've experienced. You know, we've called it trends from the trenches, but some of the ground truths we've experienced in the fight against ransomware. And Deloitte's journey in the fight against ransomware really started in 2017 when Maersk was hit by NotPetya, and that, you know, was a huge global incident. We're allowed to talk about our involvement in it because of how big it was. And from then, since then, we've been on this journey of improving how we help clients respond and recover from major ransomware attacks. So that's the session for today. We're going to do a little bit on trends and threats that we're seeing at the moment, and great session on the dark web, which stole some of my sandwiches, which makes life a lot easier. And we'll cover a little bit about what we're seeing there. We'll then go into a couple of case studies, and one of them a large-scale, what we call enterprise recovery, but existential ransomware attack that took out a whole business. And the second one associated with the MOVEit vulnerability, which some of you may or may not have known about or been involved in dealing with responding for your own organizations, and how a tier 1 financial services retail bank dealt with MOVEit. And then we'll just close out with some of the challenges that we see our clients and those organizations that call us as walk-ins experience kind of on a day-to-day, the challenges that they face when it comes to recovering. As I said, we both sit within the incident response team. We both got there. Interesting hearing about the different ways people get into cyber. We both got there from completely different routes. I left the army as an infantry operations officer without a clue about what a computer actually was, and kind of fell into the Deloitte cyber grad scheme, and kind of a decade later, I'm leading the incident response and wargaming capability for the UK and across EMEA. And Caroline comes from a slightly different background, but much more exciting, so I'm going to let her introduce herself on that.
Thanks, Patrick. Nice to see you all. So actually, before I touch on my background, so I lead our the cyber practice for the Channel Islands, but I also lead our cyber incident response technical responders and sort of sit across cyber operations as well for the UK practice. My background is just under 11 years working for GCHQ. Before I joined, I did a brief stint with the JFSC when I moved back to Jersey, but pretty much it is working for GCHQ. So being able to work in incident response and being an NCSC level 1 assured responder really sort of helps bring back some of the stuff that I did with GCHQ. So thanks, Patrick.
Thank you. So that's the agenda, which I've already kind of talked through, so I won't go through it again. The final bit about how we can help, we have not got a sales slide, I promise you. But what we would like to do is, if you want to talk about some of the stuff we've helped other organisations, or just talk through some of the stuff, we've got some equally large signs outside. Feel free to come over and chat with us in the breaks or afterwards. And I think we're around for the drinks as well. So happy to talk about anything we're covering as well. We're going to try and give you some time for questions as we go through. But just a little bit on the threat landscape, and for most of you, I'm getting the sense that this is a quite predominantly industry or professional group, so majority, I'm getting the sense that are cyber professionals, but I'm sure there are some people here who aren't. And this is kind of a pretty bog standard layout of the types of adversaries that we face. And the reason I wanted to bring this to bear today was just because it allows us to talk about some of the threats and the trends, as we've already heard from our colleagues, talking about the dark web, and how, as the dark web and as the prevalence and availability of weaponry, cyber weaponry, is made to the masses, the sophistication and the motivation for attacks, it blurs the lines here, and it becomes very much a sliding scale of grey. And certainly, as we've seen, we'll talk a little bit about in a second, about what's going on in Ukraine and with Russia and the challenges imposed by that, we also start to see how the kind of state-sponsored, organised crime, hacktivism bits all start to blur. And so where maybe 5-6 years ago in your CIS textbook, this was kind of clear doctrinally, 5 separate groups, we're seeing them blend together. The other thing for organisations, and maybe it's particularly pertinent for this market, because I do appreciate what we within the Channel Islands, we have that challenge of kind of tier 1 financial services and tier 1 organisations, and then we have lots of other smaller organisations who might not feel that they are, a relevant target. And so one of the challenges and the things we see here is the concentration and the congestion of victims. And anyone ultimately can become a victim. And so it's one of those things just to be very conscious of, specific to this market. And using this model and thinking about this model when you look at your own risk appetite, your own controls matrix, and looking at that intelligence-led controls implementation allows you to think, okay, am I ever going to defeat that nation-state-sponsored attack? Probably not. Okay, where do I actually need to set my controls in order to defeat the threats that actually are relevant and pertinent to me? And for me, if we all focus on organised crime in the middle, we're going to hit the vast majority. So just a couple of those key trends that we're seeing from left to right. So less sophisticated threat actors continuing to utilise ransomware as a service. We've already talked a little bit about ransomware as a service and where those weaponry is coming from. Unlike traditional weaponry that gets dropped on the battlefield and can be picked up by one actor, as soon as a cyber weapon is released in the wild, anyone could grab a hold of it, take it, manipulate it for their own good, resell it, etc., etc. And what we're seeing is a real push away from highly sophisticated weaponry in the hands of highly sophisticated threat actors to fairly sophisticated weaponry in the hands of pretty unsophisticated threat actors. And because of, we didn't really touch on it in the threat intel piece, but because of some of the franchise models that these organizations and these threat actors use, they genuinely are franchises. You give me 1 Bitcoin, I will give you my source code, and you can set up your own little mini Conti over in a different country. Because of that franchise model, we are seeing vast differences in the sophistication of threat actors within the same threat groups. So before Conti had their little divorce, pre-invasion or just post the invasion of Ukraine, I was dealing with an incident with Conti on one hand whilst Conti were taking out the Irish Health Service on the other, and the sophistication between the same attack groups was vastly different. You had incredibly sophisticated, incredibly aware and nuanced actors who were trying to deal with the implications of what they'd done to the Irish Health Service, and then we had some pretty cowboy people over on our incident who basically had paid for the service, got given the ransomware, etc. So real challenge for us, especially for those organisations that might not necessarily see themselves as tier 1 victims or tier 1 targets, this less sophisticated threat actor getting some fairly sophisticated weaponry is a bit of a problem. The Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine has caused all sorts of challenges for the market. After the ground invasion and just leading up to the days of the ground invasion, we got asked by countless clients, CEOs, CFOs, COOs of some of the biggest organizations in the world coming to us and saying, how bad is it going to get? And it was quite easy to say, it's already pretty bad. So this isn't going to change much. The ransomware landscape isn't going to change much. Actually, it did for a period. And what we saw a trend down of ransomware attacks because a lot of those state-affiliated threat actor groups and ransomware groups who had been rife throughout 2020, 2021 were all of a sudden focused on more wipe-aware traditional attacks targeting Ukrainian critical infrastructure. And we also saw, because of the nature of the ethnic makeup of Ukraine, we saw the challenges associated with people working in organizations where they don't like each other. And so we saw organizations who are very prevalent, like Conti, start to separate, divorce. We saw all of Conti's, basically all of their targets, all of their information, their source code, everything leaked and made public because of that divorce between ethnically Russian and non-ethnically Russian Ukrainians, both in the same organization. So it kind of lends to that point we were talking about earlier around how the landscape is changing and how these groups are evolving. The third one I think is really relevant, and we've looked at, I mentioned Move It earlier, and Klopp, we'll talk a little bit about Klopp, but we are seeing a much more focus on the data. And I think we all think of ransomware as the malware that does the encryption, whereas what we should be thinking of is ransomware as the attack. It is the end-to-end life cycle, and we'll talk through 2 examples of what that life cycle looks like. But specifically now, and with the reduction in dwell time that we heard about earlier, we are seeing actors get in, get the data, focus on the data, and if they don't hit the big red button and nothing goes bang, so be it. I've got the data. And fundamentally, it's the data that puts the fear of God into organizations. Operational outage is massive, but only if you have things that need to function for your business to be successful. Only if you can't recover services fairly quickly, large-scale infrastructure, etc. So the data is becoming more and more important in these attacks, and that's all being driven by a lot of the threats of GDPR, some of the regulatory implications of lost data, but also the reputational and kind of customer trust angles associated with lost data. The fourth one, very much linked to Move It and Klopp again, but if you aren't the victim, I guarantee someone in your supply chain will be. Pretty much, the number of incidents I've worked with where, as part of informing the downstream or upstream suppliers within the victim's supply chain, they have had that same incident very recently. I did one with a large aeronautical engineering manufacturer. They had an incident. Boeing was like 90% of their sales. We informed Boeing that this incident had happened, and Boeing went, "Oh, here's a load of data, threat intel, all this stuff that we dealt with when we dealt with that threat group a few months ago." So that reality check is that if it isn't you, and again, if we think about the makeup of a large amount of the Jersey economy and the islands economy, and a lot of that outsourcing, managed service providers, et cetera, that just leads to more challenges within your supply chain, less things in your own control. And so the likelihood of someone in your supply chain becoming victim or being targeted, actively targeted, like Klopp are doing, really, really prevalent. And finally, something we will see more of, we've already seen it for years with North Korea and a little bit with Iran, but the likelihood is as the sanctions continue to get worse on Russia, as challenges continue to get, as the economy is challenged, as Putin tries to maintain his stranglehold on the country, the need for foreign currency to drive things like the black market and the need for foreign currency to basically keep the country afloat and move and liquidate basically organizations is going to see what we think an uptake in the use of ransomware to basically continue to fund the war. So real challenges there. It's things we've already seen, but if Russia starts to play on that stage, it becomes a much bigger challenge because they are such a prevalent actor within this space. So just to kind of go through, again, some of those kind of common things that we're seeing. We've got the three major actors, or three examples of major actors there, and some of the differences between them. Again, you can start to see a lot of the linkages between the fact that a lot of these are Russian-based. The interesting one that I'll talk about, which we'll talk about in the case study again, is Klopp, because Klopp are actively targeting those organizations that manage data or move data or host data on behalf of other organizations. And they've done it now 3 or 4 times to various different file sharing protocols or file sharing platforms in order to create this massive this massive reputational risk and challenge, regulatory risk and challenge, and drive payment. And the interesting thing about Klopp is they are doing it at commoditized scale. So Move It, they didn't actively approach any single victim. They basically put a public statement out saying, if you were a victim of this incident, give us a call. We'll talk about how we pay. So really interesting kind of that change in tactic from a lot of times, it's all behind a paywall, all behind a kind of closed off, kind of murky discussions between negotiators and threat actors. And then all of a sudden, Klopp are like, now let's do it on BBC homepage. Those motivations there, fundamentally, ransomware all boils down to financial gain. If the threat actor is not using it for financial gain, i.e. they're using it for disruption or they're using it for activism, it is probably not a ransomware attack. It probably is more of a disruptive cyber attack. It is probably something that has a much darker and much unrecoverable connotations to it. So something to be conscious of. But ultimately, a lot of these, any cyber attack will have impacts on all of those. And then just to cover some of those prominent tactics there, we see the multiple layers of extortion. For the exec and the board members in the room, if there are any, we continue to see active targeting of board members, execs, and also previous retired board members being aggressively targeted. I like the comment around the customer service angle. What I would consider very aggressive customer service. Your organization's been impacted, or your previous organization's been impacted. You might want to make sure that they pay. And so we see that aggressive targeting of employees, specifically C and non-exec level employees, and we see the attempt at use of denial of service attacks to kind of again ramp it up. But fundamentally, the big two in that multi-layer of extortion is the encryption to create business disruption, hold your business physically hostage, and then the data aspect to it. Living off the land, we are seeing more and more the use of existing technologies, of standard protocols within the organization, standard administrative tools being used, and one of the biggest ones is PowerShell. The number of organizations that we go to and we do assessments in advance or during an incident, we go, why have you given everybody in the organization access to PowerShell, and why is it's such a fundamental control that can be locked down? And there's always a good reason for it, but how can we mitigate that and force the attacker to use something that is more custom, more bespoke, more obviously malicious, and allow us to detect it and hopefully stop it? Because ultimately, we're not here to do instant response, we're here to do instant resolution. And finally, I mentioned it already, but the weaponization of the supply chain and third parties. And again, if you are not the victim, inevitably at some point your supply chain will be. And then it will all come down to, your response will all come down to how important a client or a customer are you of that third party. So that becomes quite a challenge when massive organizations, multiple clients, and you're not particularly high on the pecking order. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline now, who's going to take us through Project Alpha, which was a large-scale existential incident for a manufacturing client. Caroline.
Thanks, Patrick. So I'm going to talk about Project Alpha. I was trying to think of which ransomware incident or which incident to talk through, because we respond to a lot. And in the last few years, the number of ransomware incidents that we respond to just continues to increase. But the reason I picked this one, apart from the fact that I lived and breathed it, and still are living and breathing it, is because of the actual impact that this incident actually caused. So the client, which obviously I can't talk about, was a global manufacturing company. They are very large, and the incident, so for those of you, they had about 100, 200,000 endpoints and several thousand servers, all of which, when we got the phone call to turn up on day one, was turned off. So the entire organization was pretty much had to be rebuilt from scratch. So it was pretty large. We turned up on day one, and I led the investigation throughout. The investigation actually took from May until August because of the size and scale of it. But I think what was really key with this, and what we see time and time now, is the actual recovery element that goes alongside it. So in addition to when we turn up and respond, so when I bring my incident responders with me, we will also bring the recovery team with us as well. So this incident, and like we do with all our incidents, sort of tend to follow the kill chain that we know it. So the objectives that we're trying to understand is sort of, how did somebody get in? Who is patient zero? How did they get in? When? What did they do when they got in? How did they escalate their privileges? How did they laterally move? What was the sort of, the compromise or devastation they caused once in the network? Was data exfiltrated? And then did they, launch ransomware at the end? It's pretty much what we follow with all our incidents. And it's with this particular one, this was a third party that was compromised. They remoted it, they were connecting in to their remote access solution with the threat actors, that is, were using the compromised credentials from the third party, and they gained access. This particular one was actually slightly different so we are seeing, as we sort of mentioned earlier, the dwell time being shortened. However, this one was slightly different in that they were actually in the environment for quite a long time. They came in and out several times throughout this period, all of which went completely undetected. The only time that this was detected was when it was really too late. And this is what we also see with many of our incidents. So the reason it was detected in the end was data exfiltration. So we then had to piece back from the data exfiltration as to, what happened. Whilst all this was going on, the actual sort of devastation and impact really became clear. So the business that is global, manufacturing, needed to operate, and they couldn't currently operate at the moment. So as it says there was both an operational, financial impact, there was an issue with the critical IT infrastructure, and also the IP and data impact. So it was huge, and the sort of, whilst the investigation was going on, was sort of the other things of how do we bring everything back? What is critical to the organization? How do we sort of, what we say, like, how do we make this business a company again? And how can we make them operate? So in the sort of, we're trying to investigate whilst we're also trying to get the company up and running, which also comes with various different impacts and pressures and stresses. So this particular incident was ransomware. They did take a very large, significant amount of data, 450 gigs, roughly, that did get uploaded to the dark web. And most of that was initially undetected by the client. So I guess, recovery took, I've put the dates there of 28 and 56 days to get basic critical IT and OT back up and running. But I think the key point with that is that was literally just the critical system to actually make them operate. So I am still there. There was an entire recovery team that was still there for over a year. And that is to actually get them back being able to operate like they used to operate. So why was the recovery really so difficult, and why did it take so long? So I suppose some of those down there probably won't be a surprise to many of you. However, this is what we see in most of our incidents, is that there is no prioritized planning. So one of the first things when the recovery team turn up, when we turn up with incidents, is, what are your critical assets? And, they don't know. So there has to be a whole process to understand exactly what is critical in order to actually help recover the business. In this particular incident, but obviously everything was currently switched off as well. They took, not only was data exfiltrated, but, Active Directory was also taken. So then there needs to be an entire Active Directory rebuild that went alongside this. The team size was really small, and the IT team was sort of, dotted in different parts of the world, but again, didn't really have any capacity to actually be able to do this sort of at scale. There was a lack of visibility, so there was no sort of understanding of what assets existed in the business. And again, this is something we see all the time. So I remember once we saw that this server was encrypted, and we were trying to find out what this asset was that was located in Germany. And no one knew what it was. So, but again, we see that. And I guess the key thing really about the sort of lack of security tooling, I know now a lot of businesses are getting, the SIEM and EDR and everything. But again, we still see there are gaps. And I think a lot of businesses that we see when we respond, they think because they do have an EDR tool that, it's okay. In this particular incident, they didn't actually have an EDR, and they had a light touch SIEM. But all in all, that didn't help with why this went undetected. But I'm just very conscious of time, so I'll hand Patrick quickly.
Thank you very much.
Right.
One of the interesting things about EDR is we have recently seen an incident where EDR was used to propagate the ransomware across the organization. They actually used it as the push mechanism. So, it's one of those, be careful what you wish for. Wyvern, I'm going to just gloss over this. Move It was so heavily talked about in the press, but fundamentally what happened was Clop targeted a data file sharing platform, which loads of organizations had, and there were loads of compromised servers which had this existing vulnerability. Our particular client, it was an organization who printed the bank statements and sent those bank statements then onto my client's customers. And as a result, they held quite significant amounts of personal data. One of the challenges we obviously had from a business impact perspective was by losing that customer data and it being posted on the data leak site, you had all of the challenges associated with the trust of the customer. How do you manage the trust of the customer? Annoyingly, or to make it worse, the customers in this particular case were all highly sensitive, because it was that time of month when they sent out bank statements to those people who either had defaulted on credit or had issues with the bank. So actually the information they held might be classified as a kind of sensitive data. But you can see all of the other challenges there associated with it. One of the big things that I just wanted to call out here was the leadership resourcing. An incident that didn't actually hit the bank that I was working for. The incident happened to a third party on a server that they had. It related to the data of my client, but fundamentally that involved the executive and non-executives being on meetings after meeting after meeting to brief stakeholders, brief shareholders, engage with each other, run basically a crisis constantly for a period of weeks. And as a result, that takes away from their ability to do their day job. And it's, again, something that comes a bit of a challenge if you're dealing with an incident at that level of severity that actually hasn't had much operational impact. You still have a business to run. Again, you'll see there some of the challenges that this organization faced. Documentation, roles and responsibilities, the escalation pathway of how things would be escalated out of hours, and decision-making, real challenges in this case. But just to finish, I want to cover on why ransomware remains a challenge and where do organizations struggle in their ability to respond and recover. The big one I'm going to focus on here is prioritized recovery. When we talk about prioritized recovery, we are talking about something called a minimal viable company. What is that absolute crown jewel layer within your organization, those business services that without which you will cease to operate? You lose your license, you lose your customers, you lose your right to exist as a business. And it is outstanding, or it's probably the wrong word, but it is amazing to me how many organizations don't truly know what their minimal viable company is. So if you take anything away from what we've covered today, going away, looking at what that minimal viable company is from a business service layer, that is product on shelf, shelf to warehouse, whatever it might look like, invoice in, invoice out. What is that absolute bare minimum that allows your organization to exist? Then you look at the technology that was required to it. And finally, you work out, if that technology was taken out, what do I do? And how do I continue to maintain that business service? And then you have what I would consider a truly resilient, minimal viable company. I think we're at time, so I'll hand over. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting.
We do have time to squeak in one question if anyone has one. Stephanie, be kind enough to grab a mic just so that we can hear the questions in the recording later and online. We will bring it to you shortly.
I'm loud enough.
Yeah, unfortunately it doesn't come on the recording, which we're going to publish. So give Steph just 5 seconds and she'll be sneaking up behind you. Just there to your left.
Hello.
Hello.
From the Deloitte-esque world of instant response, where do you believe and where do you experience the buck stops with this in terms of breaches? CEO? CISO?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it is a business issue. Ransomware incidents are not a technical issue. The ransomware on the server that encrypts something and isn't prevented from encrypting it, it may be a technical issue, but the impact to the organization is fundamentally a business issue. As the example Caroline presented, that was factories not being able to make widgets and put those widgets on shelves and make money. That is not a problem that IT or a CISO needs to solve. I think the challenge we have is encouraging and enabling CISOs and CTOs and CIOs to be able to have that conversation with their exec, with their non-exec, with the boards, with the supervisory bodies, with the holding boards, all of the other organizations that make up the governance structure of an organization, understand what actually matters to them, and then be able to bring that back and use that to influence, alongside the threat intelligence on side, alongside their own experiences, influence what those things are that they protect, what those things are that they invest in, what is realistic in terms of the ability to, because this all comes down to money, right? How much can I invest into my controls and into my security? So that's where we see the challenge, and the challenge still exists. But I run probably 3 or 4 tabletop exercises with execs every week, like constantly training executive and non-executive leaders in how to respond in these incidents, because the strategic decisions that need to be made to help recover and respond in these types of scenarios sit at that level. They do not sit at the technical level.
Caroline, Patrick, thank you very much.
Thank you.